As of recording this video, the Netflix live-action adaptation of One Piece has been out for about a week now. So being the One Piece fan that I am, I was excited to see how this live-action version would turn out. And once the show was finally released, I tried to watch it as soon as I could. Now today I wanted to sit down and give my thoughts on the live-action adaptation of what I would consider to be my favorite manga series, One Piece. What's going on, everybody? It's your boy Speakerhead, and today we're going to be discussing the Netflix live-action One Piece series. But before we get into this video, if you guys enjoy this sort of content and want to see more of it, make sure to like and subscribe. It really does help out the channel. We have a goal to hit 1,500 subscribers by 2024, so if you want to help me reach that goal, make sure to subscribe. Also, if you enjoy any of the music in this video or just want to support the channel in general, it's all part of my royalty-free music label, Speakerhead Studios. All the music on this label is completely royalty-free, so go ahead and use it for any of your content creating needs. Finally, I want to mention if you want to support the channel directly and get access to some exclusive perks, you can become a channel member today. One last thing I want to mention before we get into this discussion is that there will be spoilers for the live-action Netflix series along with some spoilers for the anime, so spoiler warnings right now. Hey everybody, this is Speakerhead from the future here. While editing this video, I noticed my original video for this discussion ended up being much longer than I was expecting. So instead of having one super long video about this series, I decided to split my original video into two separate discussions. That being said, the first part will be discussing the Straw Hats and the different arcs leading up to the Baratie. In the second part, we'll talk about everything after the Baratie plus my final thoughts on the series. Hopefully I should have the second part of this discussion up shortly after releasing this video, but it was important that I mention this. But without further ado, let's get back to talking about some live action One Piece. So as I mentioned before, I'm a pretty big fan of One Piece, and currently I'm caught up with both the anime and the manga. Plus one of the 3 tattoos I currently have is going to be a One Piece tattoo on my back because I enjoyed the series so much. But getting back to One Piece, it's been the main series I've kept up with for a few years now, so when the live-action adaptation was announced, just like every other One Piece fan, I was super interested to see how it would turn out. Especially since other live-action adaptations of different anime have been notoriously rated poorly by both critics and the average viewer. So I think most One Piece fans were pretty skeptical to see how this series would actually turn out. But now that it's been out for about a week, most people can agree that this is probably one of the best, if not the best, live-action adaptation for an anime that's been created. However, that being said, as I mentioned before, considering what we've gotten in the past, that isn't really saying a whole lot. Now, I watched this series once fully, but after getting some images for the video and taking some notes, I probably watched the series about 2 different times at this point. And I gotta say that I really enjoyed both times watching. I'm also not someone who watches live-action media too often, since I don't watch TV that much these days, but I thought it was a pretty good series for what it was. So the first thing I really want to discuss about the show is going to be the overall casting choices. I thought every casting choice was great, and I really enjoyed every actor's performance in this show. And with the awesome costume designs, I think that these really showed off the One Piece characters really well in a live action scene. Now, there were some casting choices I thought were better than others, but I think every actor and actress did a great job portraying their respective characters. And the main characters I want to talk about right now are going to be the Straw Hat crew, since they're the characters we mainly focus on. For the Straw Hats, I think every actor did an awesome job. For Naki Godoy, I think he did a great job as Luffy. I think trying to portray Luffy in live action is a difficult thing to do, since a lot of the stuff he does is pretty cringy and weird, but I think he did an excellent job portraying Luffy in live action. And quickly talking about his stretching powers, I think they overall looked pretty good in the show. Obviously, they weren't amazing, but I think they looked pretty good. Because to be completely honest, I don't know how you make a rubber person actually look realistic, so I think for what they did with the CGI, I think it was pretty good. And I think it helped a majority of the stretching scenes were very fast, so you didn't really see it too much. But now getting back to the Straw Hats, the next one I want to talk about is Emily Rudd as Nami. As for her performance as Nami, I think she did an excellent job. However, when it comes to Nami in the show, I think the creators made some minor changes to her story that made things a bit more confusing in the show. But I'll touch on that later in the video. As for her character, at first I felt that Nami was a bit too serious in this show. However, looking back in the anime, she was a pretty serious character in the East Blue Saga and only really started to show her cheery self after she got free from Arlong. Plus, the live-action adaptation does have a bit more of a serious tone to the series, so having Nami be a bit more serious throughout the show makes a bit more sense. Now moving on to Mackenzie as Zoro, this is the Straw Hat I've seen the most discussion about. While some people really enjoyed his performance as Zoro, there were also some people who were not as big of a fan of his performance. Personally, Zoro was my favorite Straw Hat, if not my favorite character in this entire live-action series. I totally understand how some people didn't like how Zoro acts like he doesn't really care about anything in this live action series, but I thought it made his jokes even more funny. The fact that he acts like no one is really a challenge to him until he faces Mihawk is pretty normal for his character, especially in the East Blue Saga. That being said, I wish he did show a bit more emotion, especially during the impactful scenes throughout the series. I get that he's supposed to be this demon pirate hunter, but Zoro does have more of a personality than just being a super serious character all the time. But like I said, whenever Zoro did make a joke, it at least made me chuckle a little bit. Now moving on to Jacob Romero as Usopp, I think he did a great job as well in this role, but I wasn't a fan of his character in the show. Now when I say this, I mean that Jacob Romero did a great job representing Usopp in the show. However, some important parts about Usopp's story were either changed or downplayed a lot. For example, in the climax of the Kuro fight, in the manga, Usopp saves Kaya from Django. But in the live action series, Django isn't a part of the story, so this never happens. Another example is going to be during Usopp's battle with Chu during Arlong Park. In the manga, it was a pretty big deal for Usopp to get his first victory all by himself and overcome his fears. But in the live action series, this scene felt very downplayed and wasn't as impactful of a moment. But going back to Jacob Romero's performance as Usopp, I think he did an excellent job portraying Usopp. In fact, I found Usopp to be a much more enjoyable character in the live action series compared to his manga counterpart. I should only mention I'm only talking about Usopp in the East Blue Saga because anime and manga fans know that Usopp becomes a much better character as the series goes on. But like I said, I think Usopp was a much more enjoyable character in this series compared to his manga counterpart. So moving on to our last Straw Hat shown in this series, we have Sanji played by Taz Skylar. Now when I watched the One Piece anime for the first time, Sanji was my favorite Straw Hat until my current favorite Straw Hat was introduced. But in this series I felt pretty indifferent about Sanji. Maybe it was because he was the last Straw Hat we were introduced to, but I felt like we just didn't see enough of him to have a strong opinion about the character. I'll also admit his accent did throw me off a bit, almost giving me some 4Kids dub vibes. But once I listened to his voice a bit more, I really didn't mind it. So once again, I didn't really hate Sanji in this series, I just felt like he didn't get enough screen time to show off his personality. That being said, one thing I did like about the character is that they toned down his love for women and just made him a flirt, which is probably a good choice by the creators of this series. But now that we discussed all the different Straw Hats, let's actually start talking about the series and the different arcs. And the first scene I want to talk about is going to be Roger's execution. So just quickly talking about this scene, I think it looks pretty awesome. It was interesting to add Garp to Roger's execution, but spoiler warnings for the anime. It makes sense that Garp is there since he was Roger's marine rival. But I thought the execution scene looked great, and I like how they added the young versions of Mihawk, Shanks, and Smoker in the crowd. There was also some focus put on this mysterious woman in the crowd that nobody in the One Piece community really knows who she is. However, there have been some theories on who she might be. Somewhat of a spoiler for the manga, but many people theorize that this is Crocodile, one of the 7 warlords of the sea. But this is a completely different topic we can save for another day. But for the execution scene, I think it was a great recreation of the original scene from the manga. So in our first arc, we get introduced to our protagonist Monkey D. Luffy, and we also get introduced to our first antagonist, Iron Mace Alvida. I think Alvida was pretty cool in this series, and I really liked her introduction battle scene. It was a great way to start off the series, and it was also a great way of showing us the viewers how violent the show is going to be. I assume the show would have some dark and violent moments since there were some of those in the One Piece manga. But after seeing the brain matter of the guy Alvida crush the skull of on the deck of this ship, I knew this was probably going to be a bit more graphic than I was expecting. I'll also mention I don't mind the blood and gore, but I was just surprised to see brain matter in the first 15 minutes of the series. Speaking of matter, the one that actually cleans up the brain matter is going to be Kobe. And I think the actor playing Kobe in this series was spot on. Besides nailing the look of Kobe at the beginning of the story, he perfectly portrays the character from the East Blue Saga. But fast forwarding a bit to the fight with Luffy and Alvida, I thought this was a pretty decent introduction to Luffy's Devil Fruit powers. So one of the big things many people were concerned about in this live action adaptation is how the special effects would look for the Devil Fruit powers. Personally, I thought most of the special effects looked pretty good, but some parts didn't look the greatest. However, when it comes to Luffy's Devil Fruit powers, I think they looked fine throughout the entire series. Like I said before, I'm not really sure how to make a body stretching ridiculous lengths look good, so I think the team behind the series did a great job with the stretching effects. So moving on from Alvida's fight with a satisfying punch, we move on to the introduction of Zoro. Now this scene actually shows us an interaction that was only mentioned in the manga, which was when Mr. 7 invited Zoro to join the organization Baroque Works. However, as shown in the live action adaptation, Zoro turns down the invite since he would only join if he could be number 1. I also thought it was a nice showing of Zoro's humor when he flipped off Mr. 7 when he said he wanted to be number 1. But after a short but sweet defeat of Mr. 7, we move on to Nami's introduction. In this scene of Nami stealing the boat from the Buggy Pirates is ripped straight from the anime. And I really like this scene because it really shows off Nami's clever thinking right away. After our introduction to Nami, we head to our first island in our first arc at Shellstown. And along with this, we have our next antagonist, Captain Axehand Morgan. And right now I'll briefly just talk about Captain Morgan. He looked pretty good in this series, but I don't think he was that bad of a guy in this series compared to the manga. In the original telling of One Piece, Captain Morgan was extremely egotistical and killed his own men frequently. However, in the live action series, he's still got an ego, but the worst thing that he's shown to do is backhand his son with the blunt part of his axe, which, in my opinion, the dude kinda deserved it. In the manga, this is when the viewers got to see, even though the Marines are supposed to be the good guys in this world, there are good Marines and there are bad Marines. So toning down how evil Captain Morgan is really just changed the overall impact of this. Also, considering that I mentioned a bit earlier that this live action series isn't afraid of showing some violence, so it's interesting the creators of this show decided to tone down the violence for this arc. But now getting back to the story, the first scene we get of this arc is going to be Luffy and Kobe looking at the board with all the bounty posters. And I really liked all the Easter eggs that the creators put in, such as the wanted posters for Bellamy, Django, and Foxy, along with many other Easter eggs. But moving on in the arc, this is where the live action adaptation makes its first major change to the story. The change this version of One Piece makes is that Luffy, Zoro, Nami all meet in Shellstown at the bar, compared to the manga where Nami wasn't present for the Shellstown arc at all. But besides that major change of the story, the overall plot of Shellstown is generally the same besides some minor changes of how it's told. Zoro still gets in a fight with Helmeppo, who is just as annoying in this series as he is in the manga. However, in this telling of the story, after Zoro kicks the crap out of Helmeppo, Zoro willingly goes with Helmeppo after he mentions that Captain Morgan is his father and he can give Zoro money. But after a brief scene of Captain Morgan trying to recruit Zoro into the Marines, which is also different from the manga, Zoro gets tied up in the courtyard of the Marine base for 7 days. Also mention this is another change of the story because in the manga, Zoro was originally supposed to be tied up for 30 days. But the creators of this story made it much more reasonable with 7 days, which makes much more sense. But that being said, the time didn't really matter because Captain Morgan planned on leaving Zoro tied up until he died anyways. However, shortly after being tied up, Luffy unties Zoro and then asks him to join his crew. And right here, Zoro refuses to join the crew and they go their separate ways, but he does come back to help later. Now moving on, there was a little bit of stuff that happened inside the Marine base, including Luffy and Nami having a quick interaction with Captain Morgan, along with breaking into the captain's office and stealing the safe that contains the map to the Grand Line, which for those who might not be aware is what everyone's after in this season. But once Nami and Luffy steal the safe and get to the Marine courtyard, a big fight breaks out. And this is where Zoro comes back and he decides to help out the crew. And this is also when we get the fight against Captain Morgan, and the action during this fight was pretty enjoyable to watch. Just like many of the other fight scenes we'll be talking about, the choreograph in this fight was very well done. And even though most of these fights were just your average fist fights and sword fights, they did make sure to show that in this world, people can be much stronger than your average human. It is toned down a little bit from the original story, however, I think the creators got the same point across to the viewers of the series. But after a swift defeat of Captain Morgan, the Straw Hats flee with the safe, which by the way, when Zoro just throws that over his shoulder, that's just freaking awesome. But the Straw Hats were able to get away with the safe that contains the map of the Grand Line. And someone who's very interested in getting that map is the villain of the next arc and my favorite villain in the show, Buggy the Clown. So to me, Buggy was one of the absolute highlights of the series. The actor playing him did an amazing job representing Buggy by showing how funny but also how terrifying he can be. I'll admit I wasn't a huge fan of the quick glimpses we saw of Buggy in the trailers, but after watching the series, he was one of my favorite characters in the live action series. But getting back to the arc, it starts out with the Straw Hats getting ambushed by Buggy's crew. Then the Straw Hats are brought back to Buggy's circus tent so he can get his hands on the map to the Grand Line. And in this arc, we finally get to see Buggy's Chop Chop Fruit abilities. When it comes to Buggy's Devil Fruit powers, the creators of the series decided to leave the parts where Buggy detaches his body parts flesh tone, which is probably for the best. It would probably be a bit too graphic to see all of Buggy's internals such as his bones and muscles, so it's probably a good idea to go with the manga technique. But this arc plays out roughly the same way as in the manga, except when Buggy locks Luffy in a glass container and fills it with seawater, which is completely new. But of course before Luffy drowns, Zoro and Nami end up saving him. But after some nice action scenes with the Straw Hats fighting Buggy, they eventually defeat him by trapping his body parts in some empty containers. Because of this, Buggy gets reverted to his tiny form he had during the cover story in the manga, which is really fun to see. But once the Straw Hats defeat Buggy, they release the villagers of the island who were imprisoned and forced to be Buggy's audience. It was also fun to see a quick cameo from Chow Chow the dog, which played a bigger role in the manga. So after the defeat of Buggy, the Straw Hats move on to the next island on their adventure, which is Syrup Village. And on this island we get introduced to our next crewmate, which is Usopp, and I already talked about him earlier. So before we actually start talking about this arc, I should mention that this is where the pacing of the show really starts to slow down. Everything I just talked about happens in the first 2 episodes of the series. And for the rest of the series, every arc is going to be 2 episodes long, which is one of the main problems I have with the series, but I'll get into that later. But getting back to the Syrup Village arc, the main villain for this arc is going to be Captain Kuro, captain of the Black Cat Pirates. And I really like the actor's portrayal of Captain Kuro and his 2 subordinates, Sham and Butchie. I think they were all great villains and I really liked how they were in this series. And I think the fight between Zoro, Sham, and Butchie was one of the best fights so far. But quickly talking about Captain Kuro himself, I really liked the character in the show. He seemed fairly charming as Klahadore and he also seemed very menacing as Captain Kuro. And honestly, I don't think we could have had a better portrayal of Captain Kuro in live action. So getting back to this arc, it was set up a bit like a mystery on who the villain was, however it was fairly obvious from the beginning of the arc that Klahadore aka Kuro was the villain. Even though it was fairly obvious, I did enjoy the scene where Kuro revealed his true self. I did enjoy the Luffy and Kuro fight at the very end, but as I mentioned earlier when I was talking about Usopp, I didn't like how Usopp didn't really get to do anything important in this arc, considering that this is the arc where he joins the crew. I also found it kinda weird how they decided to throw Zoro's flashback into this arc instead of all the way back in Shell's Town. And quickly talking about the Straw Hat flashbacks, I thought they were all pretty decent. I definitely got emotional during the impactful parts of the flashbacks, so I thought they were pretty solid. However, I wasn't a fan of how the flashbacks were all split up, that was kind of annoying. I just wish they kept all the flashbacks in one chunk instead of separating them into multiple pieces. But getting back to the Syrup Village arc, once again I was pretty disappointed in how Usopp generally was. The only thing that Usopp did was bring the Marines to Kai's manor to arrest Kuro. But since I mentioned it, it's probably a good time to talk about what is probably the biggest change to the series, which is the Marine involvement so far. In the manga version of the East Blue Saga, the Marines didn't play that major of a role in the series. However, this live action adaptation has a much bigger focus on the Marines. Going back in time to the Shell's Town arc for a moment, when the Straw Hats left after stealing the map to the Grand Line from Captain Morgan, Kobe ended up joining into the Marines like he always wanted to. Shortly after Kobe joined the Marines, Vice Admiral Garp went to Shell's Town and he ended up taking all the new recruits under Captain Morgan's control and took them under his control to help him catch the Straw Hat Pirates. And of course among those cadets, Kobe was there along with Helmeppa with his classic goofy haircut. By the way, I want to mention that scene where Helmeppa was naked playing with Zoro's katana was definitely one of the best scenes in the show. I'm sure most One Piece fans can agree, even though Helmeppa sucks, Helmeppa ass is always hilarious. But getting back on topic, scenes of Garp and the Marines' perspective on things is frequently sprinkled into each arc. On one side of things, I like seeing the cover story of Kobe and Helmeppa being trained by Garp brought to the live action adaptation. On the other hand, I don't like how much they're in the story because it's mainly just a bunch of talking and makes some parts feel very slow and drawn out. Now this ties us back into our previous discussion of Usopp running into the 2 Marine cadets and bringing them to the manor. But once they arrive, they get told to leave by Kuro, who's pretending to be Klahadore at this point. And after this, Luffy gets into his final fight with Captain Kuro and finally defeats him. Then the following day, after defeating Captain Kuro, before the Straw Hats leave Syrup Village, Kai gifts the Straw Hats their iconic ship, the Going Merry. This part was also changed in the live action series because in the manga, the Going Merry was actually gifted to the crew by Merry, Kaya's other butler, which the ship is named after. But in addition to this change, there was also a scene that was added of Usopp and Kaya kissing, and this is a first for One Piece. And this is because Eiichiro Oda, the creator of One Piece, didn't want to focus on romance in his manga. Now at the end of this arc, once the Straw Hats start sailing away from Syrup Village, they get surprise attacked by Garp and his massive battleship. And at this point, and another big spoiler warning right here, it's revealed that Garp is actually Luffy's grandfather. Now this is a major change from the original story and actually spoils this secret that's revealed much later in the manga. Because in the original story, Garp isn't revealed to be Luffy's grandfather until all the way in chapter 431. So the fact that this is revealed so early on in the live action series can actually spoil those who are currently catching up on the manga. Luckily I don't need to worry about that because I'm all caught up with the current One Piece story, but for those who are new to the One Piece story, this can be a pretty big spoiler. Now after a quick sea battle with Garp, the Straw Hats escape the Marines through some fog and end up at the next arc location, the Baratier. Big shout out to our channel members. Your guys' support helps keep the channel up and running. So once again, thank you guys for all of your support.